Hello, weary traveller. I am the Lonely Knight, and tonight I shall share with you an account about how men and women of the Middle Ages sought cleanliness in a world where full baths were rare. I will guide you through what truly happened in those times, the struggles, the faith, the hunger, and the resilience that shaped the lives of those who came before us. Now, make yourself comfortable, for the story is about to begin. I often find myself wondering, where are you listening from tonight, and what hour of the day finds you as my voice reaches you? The first thing I recall from those distant days is the simple presence of water, precious and never taken for granted. Villages were built near streams, springs, or rivers, for without them, life could not continue. Men, women, and children walked daily to fill wooden pails or clay pitchers, and the effort shaped the rhythm of their existence. In towns, the sound of the winch creaking over a public well echoed through the streets at dawn, a reminder that cleanliness began with patience and labour. Every drop carried home was an act of survival as well as care. At the riverbanks, I watched farmers splash their faces in the cold currents before tending the fields. They rinsed their arms and necks, not for luxury but for necessity, wiping away sweat and earth. The poor relied on these waters, even when tainted by upstream trades of tanning or butchery. Yet for them, a quick immersion, or even just a splash, refreshed the body and restored dignity. The sight of clear water glistening in the morning light was enough to stir a sense of gratitude. In towns, wells were lifelines. Queues formed as people waited with their buckets, exchanging news while the rope lowered into darkness. Monasteries sometimes offered conduits of cleaner water, built with skill to keep filth away. Women, who bore much of the burden of hauling and heating, guarded their places carefully, for clean water meant health. I remember the weight of a brimming pail on my shoulders more vividly than any sword I carried. It was the weight of life itself. Rain, too, was not wasted. Barrels set beneath eaves filled with water that softened clothes when laundered and eased the washing of children. The scent of rainwater was fresh and less harsh than that of some wells, rich with minerals. Families treasured it, straining leaves or insects with simple cloth before use. A sudden storm could feel like a blessing, the heavens themselves granting relief to weary households. In such moments, water felt not just like a necessity, but a gift. In the cold of winter, water became both ally and enemy. Streams froze, wells stiffened, and hauling ice was a trial. Many warmed water in basins or tubs beside the hearth, enough for a quick splash on face and hands. I remember how the steam rose like incense, and the warmth against chilled skin felt like mercy itself. No man could bathe fully in such weather, yet no one wished to abandon the small ablutions that brought comfort. Even in hardship, cleanliness endured. There was a wisdom in choosing where to wash. Flowing water was sought after, for stagnant pools brought illness. Villagers knew that a spring's clarity meant safety, while urban dwellers placed their hopes in deeper wells beyond the taint of refuse. To stumble upon a hidden spring while traveling was like finding a treasure chest of nature. I drank deeply, washed my hands, and felt my spirit lighten, knowing I touched water unspoiled by human hands. Carrying water was a labor that shaped bodies as surely as ploughing or weaving. Women bent their backs under the weight, children steadied sloshing buckets, and men filled barrels for animals and brewing. This ceaseless task kept the community in motion, for without water there could be no bread, no ale, no soap, no linen washed. Even in castles, servants hauled it up stairwells to chambers where lords washed in basins. It was work unseen, yet it sustained every layer of society. I look back and see how water, scarce though it could be, bound us all together. Whether noble or peasant, monk or soldier, every hand reached toward the same streams, the same wells, the same rainfall caught in waiting barrels. It was not the abundance of baths that defined cleanliness, but the small rituals with buckets and basins, repeated faithfully, day after day. Such memories remind me that purity in those times was not luxury, but discipline, a quiet reverence for the gift of water. When I think of cleanliness in those days, I do not first recall steaming baths, but the simple whiteness of linen. Against the skin it rested, soft yet strong, absorbing sweat and the oils of the body. This layer was the quiet guardian of freshness, worn by rich and poor alike, though the wealthy possessed many shifts and shirts, while the poor cherished only a few. Changing into a clean garment brought more relief than any plunge into water. It was linen that stood between man and foulness. The laundress became as essential as the smith or the baker. Her labour turned stained fabric into something that looked near new. She scrubbed with ash, rinsed in rivers, and dried cloth upon grass where sunlight bleached it pure. Many households counted the cost of soap and washing among their chief expenses, for no matter one's rank, a fresh linen undershirt gave dignity. The smell of sun-dried cloth was the perfume of ordinary life, cleaner than rosewater. Courtly halls and village cottages alike revealed this truth. It was not always the woolen tunic that showed one's respectability, but the neat linen at the collar or cuffs. To wear soiled undergarments was to invite shame, for it betrayed neglect of self. Even monks, who shunned worldly excess, wrote rules about how often linen should be changed. In those words lay the recognition that cloth, not constant immersion, preserved both health and order. I have seen men on campaign carry more spare shirts than weapons, knowing that sweat-soaked fabric clung and festered. A dry, clean shift was worth more to a soldier's spirit than any trinket from home. Linen protected the body under armour, reducing sores and stench. It reminded a man that beneath the dirt of war, he was still human, still bound to the same customs of care as the farmer in his field or the priest at his altar. In city streets, women displayed stacks of folded linen for sale, bleached white as snow. A gentleman who wished to impress at court would arrive with fresh cuffs peeking from his sleeves, signalling refinement. Even in households of modest means, the effort to keep at least one set of garments washed and ready was constant. People understood that the body was judged not by scent alone, but by what one wore close to the skin. Wool was heavy, stubborn, and rarely washed, but linen could be boiled, beaten, and renewed. That was its strength, to endure the harsh work of cleaning and still return to the body soft. In truth, it was linen more than water that kept the people of the Middle Ages tolerably clean. A single shirt might travel from the laundry to the body and back again countless times, each cycle a small victory against filth. To see a household's wash hung out in the fields was to glimpse its heartbeat. Lines of fluttering cloth spoke of order, patience, and quiet pride. Mothers taught daughters the skill of whitening linen as carefully as prayers, for both cleansed the soul in their own way. The rhythm of washing and wearing shaped the weeks, and linen became the mirror of one's standing. Without it, there was no true respectability. When I remember those centuries, I see not marble baths nor golden fountains, but white fabric against weary skin. It was linen that carried the burden of cleanliness, absorbing what could not always be washed away in water. Its presence marked discipline and care. Its absence revealed neglect. In that humble cloth lay the silent testimony of a people who, though seldom immersed in baths, still sought to walk through life with decency and order. The craft of cleanliness often began not with water, but with the harsh bite of lye and the softened fat of animals. In farmyards and towns, ashes from hearths were saved, mixed with water until their caustic spirit rose to the surface. Into this liquid, tallow was stirred, and from it came a soft soap, coarse yet useful. It was not the delicate cake one might imagine today, but a humble paste that served both laundry and skin when diluted. In the Mediterranean lands, a different refinement grew. Olive groves provided oil, and from it emerged the prized hard soaps of Marseille and Castile. These blocks, pale and fragrant, travelled by ship across seas, sought by courts and monasteries. I remember holding a piece, smooth and firm, a treasure compared to the greasy lumps of northern kitchens. To possess such soap was to hold not only cleanliness, but also the wealth of trade. Laundry demanded stronger measures still. Women heated great vats, pouring in lye so potent it stripped grease from heavy cloth. Shirts and sheets were beaten with paddles, stretched and rinsed again until the water ran clear. The stench of labor mingled with the sharpness of ash, yet from this toil linen emerged bright. The pounding and boiling were as much ritual as necessity, shaping the rhythm of the household. In towns, guilds of soap makers arose, guarding their secrets with care. Recipes were recorded, disputes judged, and standards enforced to protect both buyer and seller. As trade expanded, soap became an item of commerce, not merely a homemade paste. I recall markets where the scent of lye and oil mingled with spices and wool, a reminder that even something as common as soap could shape livelihoods. Not all uses were gentle. Fullers, who finished cloth, employed urine or stronger lye to scour wool, stamping and rinsing until it softened. Their workshops filled alleys with acrid odours, yet their skill clothed entire towns. In such places, one saw clearly that cleanliness was not without cost, for it stained hands, lungs, and streets with its byproducts. Still, it was accepted as the price of garments fit for wear. For the skin, milder soaps were made, often thinned with herbs or oils. Warm water and gentle rubbing eased away grime, though overuse burned the flesh. Physicians sometimes recommended aromatic baths with rosemary or chamomile added to soften the effect. I recall the relief of such washings after days in armor, when dust and sweat clung like chains. In those moments, even crude soap felt like a blessing. Though valuable, soap was never abundant. Many used it sparingly, keeping it for special washes or festal days. Ordinary rinsing with water and linen cloth sufficed for much of daily life. Yet its presence, even in small measure, lifted spirits, reminding people that filth need not cling forever. Its very scarcity made it precious, a symbol of care and renewal. Looking back, I see in soap not luxury, but determination. From ashes, filth, and fat, people fashioned a tool to preserve dignity. It was harsh, imperfect, and sometimes painful, yet it bore witness to the human refusal to surrender to grime. In every bar or lump of paste was written the story of endurance, the quiet triumph of hands that labored to keep the body and soul from sinking into neglect. What marked a person's care for themselves was often seen not in baths, but in the state of their hair. Fine-toothed combs of bone or wood were carried as faithfully as knives, tools of survival in a world where lice were constant companions. I remember sitting by the fire with companions, each of us dragging combs through our locks, watching the pests fall into the flames. It was not shameful work, but ordinary necessity, a ritual that bound households together in vigilance. Mothers checked their children's heads with patient fingers, hunting for nits among strands of hair. Vinegar rinses or herbs like wormwood were used to weaken the grip of the lice, and cloths were tied about the head to keep infestations at bay. Even monks, their tonsures bared, faced this same burden, and monasteries kept combs in their infirmaries. The battle was never won for long, but the effort signaled discipline. To neglect it was to court misery. Fashion played its part as well. In some times and places, men wore beards trimmed close, while in others, a clean-shaven face showed refinement. Manuals of conduct praised orderly hair and neat nails, signs of self-control and civility. I recall the sting of the barber's razor, scraping away more than hair, leaving a face that felt renewed. Even such small acts lightened the weight of dust and toil. Tools for grooming were varied but familiar. Tiny ear scoops, nail cleaners, and tweezers appeared in graves and households alike, showing their daily importance. They were simple objects, yet their presence reveals a truth. People valued tidiness even when grand baths were distant luxuries. To clean one's ears or trim one's nails was to declare a measure of self-respect. The body, though subject to hardship, was never wholly abandoned. Head coverings added another layer of protection. Women wore veils or wimples, men their caps or hoods, not only for modesty or warmth, but also to guard against dust and vermin. Coverings helped conceal unwashed hair and gave order to appearances. In markets and churches, the cloth upon one's head spoke almost as loudly as words, signaling whether one was careful or careless. I learned to respect this silent language, for it governed much of daily life. Herbs lent their fragrance where soap was scarce. Rinses of rosemary or chamomile freshened hair, easing the scalp and leaving a subtle scent. Some used ashes or clay powders to dry the oils that gathered with time. These practices softened the absence of frequent bathing, making grooming a bridge between labor and decency. They showed how resourceful people could be with what nature offered. Combing was more than a private act. Friends or family often did it together, catching vermin in cloths or flames, speaking softly as the teeth of the comb scraped the scalp. I remember the relief of those long strokes, the quiet intimacy of care. In such moments, the battle with lice became less a burden and more a reminder that no one lived alone. Cleanliness was a communal effort, woven into bonds of trust. Though we lived without the comforts of constant washing, the comb, the razor, and the careful hand preserved a measure of dignity. To be free, even briefly, from the itch of lice or the weight of tangled hair gave courage for the tasks of the day. These habits, humble as they seem, spoke of resilience, proof that even in hardship, men and women sought to honor themselves with order and care. Among the simplest yet most meaningful customs was the washing of hands before dining. In castles and humble cottages alike, a basin of water was set forth, for no one approached food with unclean fingers. Servants or hosts poured water from jugs over cupped hands, the stream falling into bowls placed beneath. Towels hung nearby, rough for peasants and fine linen for lords. It was a moment of preparation, transforming hunger into ceremony. In noble households, the practice took on grandeur. Metal ewers, shaped like lions or knights, aquamaniles they were called, gleamed in candlelight. Their spouts poured water as stewards announced the meal. Guests extended their hands, mindful of the eyes upon them, for neatness was as vital as courage at the table. Such rituals reminded all that food was more than sustenance. It was a reflection of order and courtesy. Even in villages, before bread and ale were shared, hands were rinsed in a wooden bowl passed from one to another. It was less about luxury than necessity, for meals were eaten with fingers, from shared trenchers of bread or meat. Grease and dirt clung easily, and washing lessened both foulness and sickness. The act bound neighbors together, turning a simple wash into a communal vow of respect. Medical wisdom lent its authority to this habit. Physicians of Salerno and beyond declared that clean hands eased digestion and preserved health. They warned of unseen humors that clung to filth, urging daily ablution before meals. Though their words were framed in theories of balance and miasma, the practice carried real sense. I found that food tasted better when my hands were free of the soil and sweat of the day. Cloth for drying was no less important. Towels hung upon walls or lay folded at the ready, bearing witness to the value placed on cleanliness. The wealthy embroidered them, marking status through weave and thread, while the poor relied on simple homespun. Yet whether humble or grand, each cloth served the same purpose: to restore dignity after the water had done its work. Monks, too, observed this discipline with precision. Before entering the refectory, brethren paused at lavers of running water. Silence reigned as hands were rinsed, preparing the body as the soul was prepared by prayer. To them, cleanliness before food was part of spiritual order, linking purity of flesh with purity of devotion. I often envied their calm, even in the smallest gestures. What struck me most was how public the act became. To neglect washing at table was to reveal sloth or arrogance, offenses that could not be hidden, A man might be forgiven for muddy boots, but not for greasy hands at supper. Such neglect shamed him before his fellows more than a stumble in battle. Clean hands, therefore, were a sign of honor. When I think back on those meals, I see the shining streams of water, hear the gentle splash, and feel the drying cloth between my fingers. The washing was never long, never elaborate, yet it prepared both body and mind. It was a reminder that every act of nourishment deserved respect, and that even in a world of scarcity, men and women sought refinement through the simplest of rituals. I often found that the quiet walls of monasteries sheltered more than prayers. They sheltered water itself, guided with skill and foresight. Benedictine rules spoke against excess, yet they commanded order, and water was part of that order. Stone channels carried it to cloisters, where monks washed their hands together before meals or after labor. These lavers, carved with care, stood as silent fountains of discipline. Their steady trickle was the sound of a life both humble and clean. Infirmaries within the cloisters offered baths for the sick, warmed by fires and tended with patience. The rule allowed comfort in illness, and so the washing of weakened bodies was seen as duty, not indulgence. Herbal infusions of sage or rosemary eased aches, while warmed water softened the harshness of toil. Though the monks themselves bathed rarely, they did not deny care to those in need. To walk their halls was to see how mercy and cleanliness intertwined. Waterworks of surprising ingenuity lay hidden beneath those cloisters. Pipes of lead or clay carried streams from hillsides into cisterns, then into kitchens, gardens, and reredaughters. The latrines that stretched along running channels. Waste was carried away by gravity, sparing the brethren from foulness that plagued towns. I remember my astonishment the first time I saw such design, for it rivaled the remnants of Rome in its practical wisdom. The kitchens, too, benefited from this gift. Water flowed close at hand for boiling, brewing, and washing vessels. Monks guarded the separation between clean and unclean, ensuring that drink and food were not tainted. Brewing houses, bakeries, and refectories all depended on the steady flow. What seemed simple at first revealed itself as the backbone of an orderly life, a hidden strength supporting every task. Discipline was not without restraint. Rules warned against bathing too often, lest it lead to vanity or sloth. A balance was struck between care of the body and care of the soul. Monks were reminded that cleanliness was a tool, not an idol, and that purity of heart outweighed purity of flesh. Yet by providing water in abundance, they ensured that the basics of health and dignity could be preserved. I recall how the brethren washed before prayers, their hands dripping clear as bells tolled. The ritual spoke softly of humility, for no one entered God's presence with the grime of fields upon them. Even the poorest traveller who sought refuge at a monastery might be offered a basin, a towel, and the kindness of water. Such gestures made the cloister a beacon of civility in a rugged world. The influence of monastic plumbing did not remain behind cloister gates. Towns that grew around abbeys often learned from their example, adopting conduits and drainage inspired by monastic craft. Builders and masons carried this knowledge into civic projects, shaping fountains and conduits that served markets and streets. In this way, the hidden pipes of monks became the veins of medieval cities. When I think upon monasteries, I see not only the chanting of psalms, but also the quiet glimmer of water flowing in stone channels. The monks, in their devotion, preserved a vision of cleanliness that extended beyond themselves. They showed that even in an age without modern pipes, it was possible to live with dignity, guided by wisdom and patience. Their water still runs, if only in memory, carrying lessons of discipline to those who would listen. The life of towns was shaped not only by walls and markets, but by the way water was brought to their people. In Paris, London, and Bruges, great efforts were made to carry springs from outside the city into stone conduits and fountains. Wooden pipes, and later lead ones, bore the precious flow beneath streets crowded with feet and carts. I remember hearing the steady sound of water spilling into basins, mingling with the calls of vendors and the toll of bells. To draw from these conduits was sometimes free, sometimes a privilege for which one paid. Citizens lined up with pitchers and buckets, waiting for their turn beneath carved spouts. Some fountains stood adorned with figures of lions or saints, reminding all that water was both a civic blessing and a sacred trust. I have stood in such queues myself, where strangers exchanged greetings while filling their vessels, united by the same daily need. Yet the conduits were not without peril. Butchers, dyers, and tanners, whose trades fouled water with blood, lime, and dye, were ordered to keep away from springs and fountains. Ordinances were posted, fines imposed, and watchmen charged with guarding the purity of the flow. Still, rules were broken, and the water of cities often carried the shadow of labor and negligence. The struggle to keep it clean was never fully won. Those who could not fetch water themselves relied on carriers, men and women, who hauled heavy pails through the streets for a coin. Their shoulders bore the weight of countless households, and their cries echoed in alleys announcing their service. I recall their bent backs and strong arms, moving steadily even in snow or rain. They were the unseen lifeline of the city, their toil ensuring that every home could wash and cook. When famine or plague struck, the importance of clean conduits became clearer still. Crowded streets bred foulness, and without protected sources, sickness spread swiftly. People prayed over fountains, asking saints to guard the waters from corruption. Physicians urged that only fresh flow be used for drinking or for washing wounds. The sight of clear water offered comfort even when the air was heavy with fear. Some cities built elaborate systems, channeling water with stone vaults and underground tunnels. Engineers measured gradients with care, ensuring the flow would not falter. Such works stood as monuments to human ingenuity, as vital as any cathedral. I marveled at how water, unseen beneath the streets, gave life to thousands above. Without it, the city's grandeur would have been nothing but dust. Fountains also served as gathering places. Markets were held nearby, gossip traded, and news proclaimed. Water was more than utility. It was the heart of civic life, a point where people crossed paths. Children played in the spray, women scrubbed pots, and men paused to rinse travel-stained hands. The fountain became a mirror of the city itself, busy, shared, and essential. Looking back, I see how these conduits and fountains changed the very rhythm of urban living. They brought the countryside into the heart of the town, making cleanliness possible even amid crowded streets. Though often polluted, they represented a striving for better order, an acknowledgement that water was the foundation of health and community. In their flow, I still hear the pulse of medieval cities, steady and enduring. There were places in the towns where water was not merely drawn, but heated, poured into tubs and shared among strangers. These were the bathhouses, whose doors opened to merchants, craftsmen, and travelers alike. I remember stepping into such halls, where steam rose in the air and the smell of soap mingled with that of food. For a fee, one could hire a tub, a towel, and a moment's relief from the burdens of daily labor. It was a respite, both for the body and the spirit. Inside, the mood was not always solemn. People spoke freely as they soaked, laughter mixing with the splash of water. Musicians sometimes played in adjoining rooms, and food was brought to those who wished to linger. To the modern ear, it may sound strange, but bathing was as much a social act as a private one. I watched merchants strike bargains over tubs, their words drifting with the steam, while children chattered nearby. Attendants kept the water warm, carrying buckets from the hearth to replenish the tubs. Soap, whether from animal fat or imported olive oil, was offered to scrub the skin. Towels, though coarse, gave comfort, and the simple act of being wrapped in one made a man feel renewed. The air was filled with chatter, the soft slap of water against wood, and the contented sighs of weary folk. Yet not all looked kindly on such places. Priests warned of immodesty. For men and women sometimes bathed together, though often separated by screens. Authorities debated rules, setting limits on hours and conduct. In some cities, the bathhouses became entwined with suspicion, accused of fostering sin as well as cleanliness. Still, many returned, for the lure of warmth and water outweighed the stern voices of reform. The Black Death altered much. Fear of contagion led many to believe that open pores after bathing made the body vulnerable to miasmas. Bathhouses, once bustling, grew quieter in certain years, their doors closing in times of plague. And yet they did not vanish entirely. Some endured, serving those brave enough to trust the cleansing power of hot water even when dread filled the streets. In regions where cold winters pressed hard, the bathhouse was more than a comfort. It was survival. A steaming soak loosened stiff joints and eased sores from heavy labor. The warmth lifted spirits, driving away the gloom of frostbitten mornings. For those who lived in drafty houses, a tub of heated water felt like an embrace. I can still recall the peace that settled over me as fatigue slipped away in the steam. The role of these places stretched beyond the individual. They gave employment to attendants, washerwomen, and keepers. They provided spaces where the boundaries of class softened, where a craftsman might sit beside a knight, both equal in their need for cleansing. Even in their decline, they left a mark on the rhythm of medieval life, remembered in the stories of those who gathered there. To speak of bathhouses is to speak of a world where water, warmth, and fellowship met in the same room. They were imperfect, sometimes maligned, yet deeply human in their essence. Within their walls, people sought not only to wash, but to belong, to share a moment of comfort in a harsh age. The memory of steam rising into rafters lingers still, a quiet testament to how even the simplest wash could restore both flesh and spirit. When I crossed the river into Southwark, the smell of hot water and smoke told me I was near the stews. These houses offered heated baths, where a man might pay for warmth, soap, and at times pleasures beyond mere washing. Their reputation was mixed. Some sought them for comfort after travel, others for indulgence frowned upon by church and crown. Yet whatever the reason, they stood as part of England's urban life, as familiar as taverns or markets. The city authorities were never blind to their presence. Rules were drawn to control the hours, the conduct, and the cleanliness of these establishments. Water was to be changed often, attendance monitored, and the houses closed on holy days. In records I once saw, fines were levied when rules were broken, reminding all that even in such places order was demanded. Discipline and indulgence walked a narrow line. Their proximity to the Thames made them convenient. Water was hauled from the river, heated in great cauldrons, and poured into tubs. Yet the same river carried refuse and filth, raising concerns about contamination. Officials debated how to ensure that what cleansed the skin did not also spread illness. The tension between need and danger haunted the stews, just as it did many aspects of medieval cleanliness. By the 15th century, the shadow of disease darkened their doors. The arrival of the Great Pox, what later generations called syphilis, cast suspicion upon the stews. Moral voices grew louder, calling for their closure, linking bodily impurity with spiritual corruption. Patrons still came, but the sense of unease grew stronger. To bathe in such a place became not only a question of health, but of conscience. Yet before their decline, they were ordinary havens. Soldiers weary from campaign, merchants stiff from travel, and townsfolk aching from labor all entered seeking relief. Food was served, ale poured, and the mingling of classes was not uncommon. In those heated rooms, one could forget the rigid hierarchies of the street, if only for an hour. For many, the stews were the one chance to feel clean and human. The Crown itself sometimes intervened. Proclamations were issued, sometimes forbidding women from serving in the baths, sometimes ordering stricter oversight. Still, the stews reopened, for the demand never truly vanished. I recall hearing sermons thunder against them, only to see the same preacher's parishioners slip quietly inside after Vespers. Hypocrisy and necessity often shared the same roof. The language of stews soon became coloured with suspicion, yet the reality was more complex. They reflected a Europe where bathing could be both healthful and controversial, where a heated tub was not merely an indulgence, but a service of daily life. Their story is not one of vice alone, but of human longing for warmth, water, and rest, however flawed the setting. When I remember the stews of Suffolk, I see the glow of lanterns reflected on water and hear the laughter that mingled with splashing. They were places of comfort, of danger, of temptation, and of relief, woven into the fabric of England's cities. Though later ages condemned them, they remind us that the pursuit of cleanliness was never simple, but always bound up with the frailty and desires of mankind. Far to the north, where winters were long and rivers froze, warmth and cleansing took a different form. In wooden huts, stones were heated until they glowed red, then doused with water to fill the room with steam. Men and women sat within, sweating until their skin dripped, then washed themselves with water drawn from buckets. This was the sauna, the sweat bath that marked the daily rhythm of Scandinavia. It was as much a part of life as bread or ale. The ritual did not end with steam alone. Bathers scraped their skin with wooden or metal tools, removing dirt and dead flesh loosened by the heat. Then, they plunged into cold rivers or rolled in snow, a shock that revived body and spirit alike. I once heard that such alternation between fire and ice hardened the flesh, preparing people for the rigors of harsh climates. For them, it was not luxury, but survival. These bathhouses were often built as small log structures, their roofs low, their interiors dark save for the glow of embers. Families gathered together, sometimes whole villages taking turns. Childbirth occurred there, the warmth easing labour, and the sick were treated with herbs laid upon the stones. In those smoky chambers, life and cleansing intertwined, and the sauna became both hospital and hearth. Among Slavic peoples to the east, similar traditions thrived. The banya, as it was called, served much the same role, a place of steam, washing, and social gathering. Birch twigs were used to strike the skin lightly, driving blood to the surface and aiding circulation. I recall tales of travellers who found themselves welcomed into banyas as honoured guests, offered heat and water before food. Cleanliness was linked with hospitality. The value placed on such baths was profound. To neglect them was to risk illness, for sweat carried away what was thought to be harmful humours. Physicians of the north praised their effect, though they explained it in terms of balance rather than germ or disease. Still, the result was plain. Those who sweated regularly found relief from stiffness, sores, and the weariness of labour. The practice endured through centuries without fading. Unlike the bathhouses of the south, these sweat baths were not seen as suspect. They carried no reputation of immorality, but instead of health, purity, and strength. Children learned from their elders how to heat stones, how to ladle water, how to endure the steaming air. It was part of the education of life, passed down as faithfully as prayer or farming. In this, they differed from many customs of Central Europe. Even when Christianity spread across these lands, the baths remained. Priests sometimes frowned, seeing echoes of pagan rites, yet the habit proved too useful, too ingrained to be abandoned. Over time, the church itself grew more tolerant, recognizing that washing in steam did not oppose faith, but preserved the body for labor and devotion. Thus, the sauna survived the tides of belief and reform. When I close my eyes, I can still feel the sting of steam in the lungs, the sudden chill of snow against the skin, the quiet relief after a long sweat. Those northern huts were humble in their walls, but mighty in their purpose. They showed that even in the hardest climates, people found ways to remain clean, to endure, and to honor their bodies. In the dance of heat and frost, resilience was forged. In the cities of Al-Andalus, the presence of hammams reminded all that cleanliness was woven deeply into faith and daily life. Steam-filled chambers echoed with the sound of water poured from bronze basins, and the sequence of warm, hotter, then cooler rooms guided the body from tension to release. I once passed through Cordoba and saw their domed roofs pierced with star-shaped openings, letting light fall softly into the mist. These places were continuations of Roman thermae, reborn through Islamic tradition. Within their walls, the rituals were orderly. Visitors entered a cool hall to undress, then progressed through chambers of rising heat, pausing to sweat and cleanse. Attendants scrubbed skin with rough mitts, poured water over shoulders, and massaged limbs until the body felt renewed. The fragrance of herbs or oils often filled the air, mingling with the steam. Cleanliness was not only practical, but spiritual, tied to the purity required before prayer. Christians and Jews living under Muslim rule sometimes used the hammams as well, for water flowed beyond faiths when it came to hygiene. Later, when Christian kings gained these cities, many baths remained in use, adopted by new rulers who recognized their value. Though suspicion occasionally arose, the practicality of heated communal washing could not easily be dismissed. The stones of these buildings carried centuries of shared customs. The architecture itself was a marvel. Arched ceilings held in the heat, while channels beneath the floors carried warm air from furnaces. Cisterns stored clean water, heated carefully so as not to scald. The combination of engineering and ritual revealed a deep wisdom. The body was to be cared for with balance, not indulgence. I admired how these halls blended beauty and necessity into one. Beyond their walls, the influence spread. Iberian cities that came under Christian rule often preserved the hammams for civic use, even as religious meanings shifted. Some were renamed, others repurposed, but many continued to serve as places of washing and gathering. This endurance showed how cleanliness, once established, could transcend politics and belief. People of every faith still needed warmth and water. Travelers carried tales of hammams northward, comparing them to the bathhouses of France or England. They noted the skill of attendants, the freshness of the air after leaving, and the vigor it gave the weary. Some noble households tried to imitate the style, though rarely with the same perfection. In the hammam, cleanliness had become both art and routine, a model many admired from afar. Even when suspicion grew, linking baths with indulgence or temptation, the hammam stood firm in their cultural roots. Physicians praised them for health, theologians for ritual purity, and ordinary folk for the relief they offered. Their presence proved that the pursuit of washing was not bound to one culture alone, but passed between peoples, reshaped by each, yet never lost. When I recall Iberia, I see the domed roofs rising above narrow streets, steam drifting into the evening air, and the sound of water echoing against stone. The hammams were bridges between worlds, carrying forward the wisdom of Rome, the devotion of Islam, and the endurance of local custom. They remain in memory as a sign that even in divided lands, the shared need for cleanliness could bind communities in quiet, unspoken unity. Physicians of the Middle Ages often spoke of washing not only as a matter of appearance, but of balance within the body. They followed the teachings of Galen and Hippocrates, seeing the human frame as a vessel of humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. When one humour grew dominant, illness took hold. Cleanliness, they taught, could restore harmony, for water and moderate heat opened the pores and released what was harmful. Bathing was a prescription as much as a comfort. Advisors in the schools of Salerno recorded regimens that linked seasons to washing habits. In spring, tepid baths soothed and prepared the body for growth. In summer, cool rinses refreshed and prevented fevers. Autumn called for moderation, while winter demanded caution, lest chill drafts undo the benefits of warm water. The wisdom may sound strange now, but in their time it was careful guidance, drawn from observation and tradition alike. Herbs often found their way into such practices: rosemary to invigorate, chamomile to calm, sage to strengthen gums and skin. Physicians recommended their infusion into bath water, believing that scent and heat together reached deep into the body. Patients left these baths not only cleaner, but believing themselves fortified against imbalance. In truth, the fragrance and warmth eased the spirit as much as the flesh. Caution accompanied every instruction. Too frequent immersion, especially in hot water, was thought to weaken the body. Open pores were believed to invite dangerous airs, miasmas carrying disease. For this reason, physicians urged restraint, reminding patients that moderation was the soul of health. I remember reading such warnings in dusty manuscripts, their Latin words careful, their tone fatherly, as if guiding a child. Beyond full baths, daily ablutions were strongly encouraged. Washing the face and hands each morning restored vigor, and rinsing the mouth kept breath sweet. These smaller acts carried less risk than total immersion and became the backbone of everyday cleanliness. Even without tubs, people practiced these habits faithfully, guided by the belief that small washings defended health. The custom was less about vanity than survival. Courts often employed physicians who oversaw bathing for nobles. These learned men prescribed not only when, but how one should wash. The temperature of water, the length of immersion, and the herbs added were all carefully chosen. Lords and ladies followed such advice diligently, trusting that cleanliness prolonged life. For them, bathing was medicine delivered by water, no less important than a draught of wine or a poultice of herbs. At times, great caution turned into fear. During outbreaks of plague, physicians warned against bathing altogether, believing that open pores invited pestilence. People withdrew from bathhouses, relying instead on perfumed cloths, quick rinses, or even avoidance of washing. Such advice shows how medical theory, though earnest, often swayed with uncertainty. Still, even in caution, the link between health and cleanliness was never severed. When I reflect on these beliefs, I see both error and wisdom. Their language of humours has faded, yet their insight that water restores, herbs refresh, and moderation preserves remains true. The physicians of old sought to keep life steady in a world of hardship, and in their counsel lay both caution and care. Cleanliness for them was not vanity, but a discipline of health, a path to resilience in fragile times. Among the hardest labours of the household was the washing of linen, a task that demanded fire, water, and unyielding strength. Women carried baskets of soiled garments to riversides or washing greens where work began at dawn. Basins were filled with hot water mixed with lye. Shirts and sheets plunged and beaten with wooden paddles. The rhythm of pounding and rinsing echoed like a drum, steady and relentless. Laundry was not light duty, but a trial of endurance. The rivers became meeting grounds as much as workplaces. Women stood knee-deep in the shallows, scrubbing cloth against stones while sharing stories, news, and songs. The water carried both filth and laughter downstream, binding the work to the flow of life. Ordinances often forbade washing near drinking sources, so towns designated places for laundresses, ensuring that health was not imperiled. Such rules revealed how vital and disruptive the work could be. Heating water required its own preparation. Fires burned all morning, consuming wood to bring great cauldrons to a boil. Ashes were sifted and soaked to make lye, a pungent liquid that stripped away grease and odour. The process left hands raw and red, skin cracked from harsh contact. Yet despite the hardship, the reward was bright linen drying in fields, a visible sign of order restored. Clean cloth became a badge of discipline. Sunlight played its part in the cleansing. After rinsing, cloth was laid upon grass or hedges, where the rays bleached and the air sweetened it. The sight of fields covered in fluttering linen was as common as cattle grazing nearby. Children sometimes played among the sheets, though they risked scolding for soiling what had just been purified. The sun itself was a partner in the struggle for cleanliness, its light renewing what water had touched. Hired laundresses served noble households, their wages recorded in account books. Castles and great manors could not run without their labour, for fine linen shifts, tablecloths, and bed sheets demanded constant care. Some households even had scheduled laundry days, when servants worked together under supervision. The task may have seemed humble, but it carried prestige, for the appearance of clean linen marked the refinement of the household. The labour was not without hazards. In winter, water froze around hands until fingers numbed, yet washing continued. In towns, the stench of communal washhouses lingered in alleys where steam and smoke poured into the air. Yet the people endured, for without clean linen, odours spread, skin grew unhealthy, and respectability faltered. The toil was relentless, but it shielded communities from decline. On feast days or pilgrimages, extra effort was given to ensure fresh garments. Families planned laundry before great gatherings, knowing that stained shirts or foul-smelling cloth would draw shame. Clean linen was as important as polished shoes or groomed hair, a mark of readiness to stand before both neighbours and God. In such moments, the work of laundresses reached far beyond the riverside, shaping how people were judged. In memory, I see tired hands wringing water from heavy cloth, steam rising from boiling vats, and white linen waving in the breeze. This was the unseen foundation of medieval cleanliness, not grand baths or scented oils, but the relentless, weary labour of those who washed. Their work gave dignity to families, health to bodies, and order to communities. In their effort, the medieval world found its quiet, enduring cleanliness. Not all cleanliness was sought with water and soap. Sometimes it came with fragrance drifting through halls and streets. Rosewater, distilled with care, was sprinkled on hands and faces, offering refreshment in both scent and touch. I recall noble banquets where servants moved down the tables with silver sprinklers, leaving behind trails of sweetness in the air. To smell of roses was to declare refinement, a sign that one lived above the stench of labour and sweat. Perfumes travelled from distant lands, carried on caravans and ships through Mediterranean ports. Ambergris from the sea, musk from the east, and civet from Africa found their way into small glass vials. Apothecaries sold them in towns, sometimes blending herbs from local fields with exotic treasures. A few drops on clothing or in hair transformed the wearer, masking the odours of crowded streets. Such scents revealed both wealth and access to trade. The humble also turned to fragrance, though in simpler forms. Bundles of lavender or rosemary hung in cottages, their aroma filling the room. Herbs tucked into pockets or girdles carried freshness wherever one walked. These were not idle indulgences, but attempts to push back against the constant presence of foul air. Even the poorest found solace in a sprig of mint or thyme crushed between fingers. Pomanders became companions for those who could afford them. Crafted balls of pierced silver or wood held mixtures of spices, resins, and wax. People carried them on cords or wore them at the waist, raising them to their noses in times of stench. Physicians encouraged their use, for they believed sweet smells defended against miasmas, the corrupt airs thought to spread disease. Whether true or not, the comfort they brought was undeniable. At court, fragrance was woven into ceremony. Kings and queens received perfumed gloves, linens soaked in aromatic waters, or garments scented with herbs. Visitors remarked on the clouds of scent that surrounded noble gatherings, contrasting sharply with the common smell of the streets outside. Perfume became a marker of class, as much as clothing or jewels. To approach the throne reeking of sweat would have been unthinkable. Religious occasions, too, bore the touch of fragrance. Churches burned incense, not only for symbolism, but to mask the odours of crowded worshippers. Priests washed their hands with rosewater before Mass, setting an example of purity, both spiritual and bodily. Pilgrims sometimes purchased scented relics or waters near shrines, believing their fragrance carried healing virtues. Thus, scent bridged the sacred and the ordinary. Fragrance was never meant to replace washing altogether. Instead, it stood beside water and linen as part of the wider pursuit of cleanliness. A clean shirt might be sweetened with herbs and freshly washed hands anointed with rosewater. In such ways, the visible and the invisible joined, making the body appear both neat and pleasing. Cleanliness became not only what one could see, but what one could sense. When I recall those days, I see silver pomanders glinting at belts, herbs drying in kitchens, and rosewater glistening on the hands of courtiers. These scents, delicate or strong, gave relief in a world where foul air was constant. They brought dignity to the wealthy and small joys to the poor. In the fragrance of herbs and oils, people found a shield against decay and a reminder that even in hardship, life could still hold beauty. Care for the mouth was never absent, though our methods were far from those known today. Toothpicks of wood or metal were common, carried even by the modest. I saw men clean their teeth after meals, carefully scraping away what bread and meat left behind. Some rubbed linen cloths, dipped in salt or vinegar against their gums, believing it kept them firm. Though caries were frequent, people did not ignore their mouths, for breath and teeth marked civility. Recipes for powders appeared in manuscripts, blending sage, mint, charcoal, or ground shells. These mixtures freshened the breath and abraded grime from teeth. I once tried such a powder, its taste sharp, its effect immediate, though harsh. Apothecaries sold small packets, while households made their own from herbs at hand. The effort revealed a shared concern, to prevent decay, or at least to slow its march. Courtesy books spoke plainly of the matter. Bad breath was condemned as offensive in company, a sign of neglect, as shameful as dirty nails or greasy hair. To speak at table while one's mouth stank was to dishonor the host. Young men were instructed to clean after meals, not only for health, but for respect. Even without mirrors, the mouth was understood as a window of character. The barber surgeon held a role both feared and respected. When pain grew unbearable, he was called to draw the tooth. I have seen men sit upon wooden stools, gripping their knees, while iron forceps wrenched bone from gum. Blood followed, and relief came only with time. The loss of teeth was common, but so too was endurance. Better an empty gap than the torment of rot. Those with means sought preventative measures. Rinses of wine or vinegar cleansed the mouth, believed to harden gums and clear foulness. Sweet herbs were chewed, anise, fennel, or parsley, leaving breath more pleasant. Women in noble houses prized perfumed pastes for their lips and teeth, blending medicine with beauty. Such habits distinguished them in gatherings where closeness of speech revealed all. For the common soldier or laborer, remedies were simpler, yet not absent. A twig of hazel or willow, chewed until it frayed, became a crude brush. Water was swilled to dislodge food, and linen wiped across the mouth when soap was too harsh. These were small acts, but they mattered, preserving a measure of dignity in a life full of toil. Pain was inevitable, yet people sought to manage it. Poultices of cloves or honey were pressed against aching gums, sometimes easing the fire for a while. Prayers were whispered, relics touched, as if divine aid might soothe where medicine failed. The mouth, so small a part of the body, could bring down even the strongest knight with its suffering. It was a reminder of our frailty. When I remember medieval care of the teeth, I see a mixture of discipline and hardship. The effort to keep the mouth fresh was constant, though tools were few. It showed that even in an age of limited knowledge, people valued the grace of clean breath and the relief of sound teeth. Their struggles echo still, for the battle against decay has never truly ended. Cleanliness in the Middle Ages was often guarded not by water alone, but by the garments one chose to wear. Linen, worn beneath heavier fabrics, absorbed sweat and oils, sparing wool and fur from constant washing. A fresh shift or shirt kept odors at bay, while outer clothing remained presentable for weeks. I learned quickly that to change linen was to feel renewed, even if a full bath lay far beyond reach. Clothing became the first defense against filth. Woolen garments, though durable, resisted washing. Water shrank and warped the weave, so people relied on careful brushing and airing. Cloaks, mantles, and tunics carried the smell of hearth smoke and streets, yet linen beneath softened the effect. Shoes and boots, maintained with grease and stitched repairs, kept moisture and rot from the feet. I remember how much care a good pair of boots required, for sore feet were the ruin of many journeys. The wealthy possessed more sets of garments, and thus more freedom. They could change frequently, sending soiled linen to laundresses while donning fresh attire. Bright colours and clean fabrics marked their rank as surely as jewels. By contrast, poorer folk owned little, perhaps 2 shifts or shirts, mended and patched until the fabric thinned. Their diligence in washing and repairing was a testament to endurance, not abundance. Odour was a constant concern. To manage it, people perfumed their garments with herbs, slipping lavender or sage into storage chests. Furs were brushed and sometimes dusted with powders to mask musk. In noble houses, garments might be smoked with incense before great feasts, so that the wearer carried an aura of fragrance. Clothing itself became a vessel of both cleanliness and social display. Armour taught me another lesson. Worn for hours, it trapped sweat and rubbed skin raw. Beneath it, linen shifts absorbed what metal could not, and frequent changes prevented sores from worsening. Soldiers who neglected this grew ill or infested with lice. Those who tended their clothing endured longer, proving that fabric was as much a weapon of survival as sword or shield. Clean linen was no less vital than sharp steel. Laundry of outer garments was rare, but careful storage prolonged their life. Wool was hung in the air, cloaks shaken of dust, and garments folded with herbs to ward off moths. This routine mattered greatly, for fabric was costly and time-consuming to produce. The effort saved not only money, but also the appearance of order. A man in well-kept clothing, even if old, carried respect. Sumptuary laws, though aimed at vanity, reveal much about these habits. Authorities restricted certain fabrics or colours to classes, fearing disorder if peasants dressed like lords. These laws did not mention cleanliness directly, yet they show how clothing reflected more than wealth. The ability to present oneself in clean, neat garments was tied to honour, law, and reputation. Appearance carried weight as great as words. When I recall these practices, I see laundresses by rivers, knights changing shifts in camp, and nobles perfuming cloaks before feast days. Cleanliness was not always about bathing, but about guarding the body with careful layers. Linen bore the burden, wool shielded from the world, and fragrance softened what water could not reach. Through fabric, medieval people preserved dignity, weaving order into their daily lives. The habits of washing rose and fell with the turning of the year, as surely as crops followed their cycles. In summer, rivers ran full and warm, and people immersed themselves more freely. Children splashed in shallows, women laundered in abundance, and men rinsed the dust of labour from their arms and faces. The season's generosity allowed for greater cleanliness, when both daylight and warmth eased the work. Clean linen dried quickly under the sun, leaving fields bright with fluttering cloth. Winter told another story. Frost gripped rivers, buckets cracked with ice, and water drawn from wells chilled the bones. Full bathing grew rare, replaced by small ablutions near the hearth. Faces, hands, and feet were washed in basins of warmed water, carried indoors with effort. I remember the sting of steam against frozen skin, a blessing in months when washing became a battle against nature itself. In such times, endurance replaced abundance. Spring brought ritual as well as renewal. Before Easter, households gave special attention to washing and clothing, seeking to appear pure for the holy season. Fresh linen was gifted or worn to mass, signaling both devotion and cleanliness. The water of melted snow filled rivers again, offering laundresses new strength for their tasks. Fields greened, and with them came the sight of linen whitening beneath the open sky. Cleanliness and faith walked hand in hand. Harvest shaped its own pattern. During weeks of relentless labour, washing was often postponed, for fields demanded every hour. Yet once the grain was gathered, people turned back to themselves, scrubbing hands blackened by earth and laundering garments heavy with sweat. Pilgrimage seasons, too, encouraged extra care. To arrive at a shrine in fresh linen was to honour both saint and self, proving that devotion included discipline of the body. Fair days and markets saw their own preparation. Families bathed, or at least washed, more carefully, for gatherings placed one among strangers, and appearance carried weight. A groom or bride was always presented in freshly washed garments, their hair combed and hands cleansed. Such customs remind me that cleanliness was never only for health. It was a language spoken in public, declaring dignity and respect. Agriculture tied directly to water's availability. When rivers ran low in late summer, washing was limited to what was possible, while wet autumns allowed greater abundance. Communities learned to adapt, never expecting uniform habits throughout the year. Cleanliness was a negotiation with weather, with daylight, and with the cycle of toil. The balance was fragile, yet it kept life in rhythm with nature. Even feast days demanded extra washing. On Christmas, linen was whitened, hands perfumed with herbs, and garments freshened despite the cold. Weddings, baptisms, and funerals carried the same expectation. To honour such moments without cleanliness was to risk shame. I recall attending a funeral where mourners spoke less of grief than of a man's unwashed state, proof that dirt could overshadow even death. When I reflect upon these rhythms, I see how medieval people shaped their lives around water as much as around bread or harvest. Cleanliness ebbed and flowed with the seasons, yet it was never abandoned. From the bright fields of summer to the frozen hearths of winter, people found ways to keep themselves and their garments in order. In this, they showed a quiet resilience, living in harmony with the cycles that governed their world. In the life of faith, water held more than practical meaning. It carried the weight of symbol and sacrament. Baptism, performed with flowing water upon the brow, was the first cleansing of a Christian soul. I stood at fonts carved of stone, watching infants lowered into basins or sprinkled by priests, their cries mingling with chants. That washing was no matter of dirt, but of destiny, a ritual that bound body and spirit to God's grace. Before Mass, priests themselves performed ablutions. They rinsed their hands at the altar, murmuring prayers as water flowed over fingers. This act reminded all that sacred mysteries required clean hands, both in flesh and in conscience. The vessels used for such washings gleamed in candlelight, small yet essential pieces of the liturgy. I remember their sound, water falling into silver basins, soft but solemn. On Maundy Thursday, the washing of feet brought humility into sharp relief. Lords bent to cleanse the feet of their servants, bishops those of the poor, echoing Christ's example at the Last Supper. I saw this practice once in a cathedral cloister, the bishop kneeling, his hands steady as he poured warm water over calloused feet. It was a moment of inversion, where power bowed to service and cleanliness carried the weight of mercy. Pilgrims, too, washed as they approached holy shrines. Springs near sanctuaries became places of both refreshment and preparation. At Santiago, Canterbury, and countless smaller chapels, basins or fountains awaited weary travellers. To wash one's face and hands was to show reverence before stepping onto sacred ground. The dust of the road fell away, replaced by the solemnity of worship. Churches themselves bore the mark of water's importance. Holy water stoops stood at entrances, inviting worshippers to dip their fingers and cross themselves. The touch of cool water on the forehead reminded each soul of baptism and purity. It was a small act, yet one repeated countless times, reinforcing the connection between bodily washing and spiritual renewal. In such moments, faith and hygiene intertwined. Festivals and processions sometimes involved washing of objects as well as people. Relics were cleansed with scented water, chalices polished with cloths dampened in wine or vinegar. These acts were not only for care of the sacred vessels, but for symbolism. The pure must be served by the pure. Even the handling of cloths at the altar reflected this discipline, as clean linen was considered indispensable to worship. Expectations of cleanliness extended to the congregation. Courtesy books and sermons urged worshippers to appear neat, their hands washed, their hair orderly, their garments presentable. To arrive at Mass with filth or foul odour was to dishonour God and neighbour alike. I recall villagers rising early on Sundays to rinse in basins before bells rang, for no one wished to be seen unprepared before the altar. As I think back, I see how the church made cleanliness part of the rhythm of devotion. The washing of hands, the sprinkling of holy water, the cleansing of feet, all pointed to a truth that went beyond the surface. These gestures, repeated with reverence, kept alive the idea that purity was both visible and invisible, that the body and soul together required care. In their waters flowed faith, discipline, and remembrance. In the towns along the Rhine, and in many other corners of Europe, Jewish communities built baths unlike those of their Christian neighbours. These were mikvaot, pools designed not for leisure or comfort, but for ritual immersion. I once saw the stone steps leading down into one, carved carefully so the faithful could descend fully into the water. The act was solemn, undertaken with quiet devotion, for it cleansed the spirit according to ancient law. The water had to be natural, drawn from a spring or rain, never stagnant or carried in buckets alone. Builders engineered channels to bring fresh flow into underground chambers, ensuring that the bath met every requirement. The cool depths were not warmed, for it was purity, not comfort, that was sought. To immerse in those waters was to renew covenant and conscience alike. Women most often used the mikveh, marking transitions of life, after childbirth, before marriage, or in cycles of faith. Men, too, entered before holy days or moments of special devotion. Each immersion carried meaning beyond the body, connecting the community to traditions stretching back through centuries. I recall the hush of those spaces, where even stone walls seem to echo with reverence. Archaeologists have uncovered many of these baths, hidden beneath houses or near synagogues. Their presence speaks to the determination of communities to maintain law and ritual despite hardship. Some were small, barely more than a pit lined with masonry, while others were carefully vaulted chambers. Each testified to the central place of washing in Jewish life, not as an option, but as commandment. These baths also influenced the broader cities around them. In some cases, Christian authorities took note of their design, recognizing the discipline with which they were built. Though outsiders sometimes misunderstood or even scorned these practices, they nonetheless contributed to the wider culture of water management in medieval towns. Cleanliness, in this sense, was shared across boundaries, though expressed in different forms. The mikveh was not a place of sociability or trade, unlike the bathhouses of Christians or the hammams of Muslims. It was quiet, sacred, and often concealed, accessible only to those bound by its laws. In that privacy lay both strength and vulnerability, for secrecy sometimes fueled suspicion. Yet for the faithful, its presence was non-negotiable, a mark of identity as much as language or worship. Even during times of persecution, when synagogues were burned and laws grew harsh, communities struggled to preserve their mikvaot. To lose them was to lose a pillar of life itself, for immersion could not be replaced by mere intent. I heard once of families who travelled far to reach a functioning bath, risking insult and danger for the sake of faith. Such dedication revealed the depth of meaning bound to water. When I look back upon these ritual baths, I see how they stood as silent witnesses to endurance, the steps worn smooth by countless feet, the chill of water embraced in obedience, the unbroken chain of practice across generations, all tell of a people's resilience. In their immersion, they carried both body and soul into renewal, teaching that cleanliness was never only of flesh, but of spirit and covenant. In moments of birth and sickness, washing took on a deeper weight, for comfort and survival both depended upon it. Midwives carried basins of warm water, clean cloths and herbs, tending mothers as they labored. Their hands, though roughened by work, moved with gentleness, cleansing and soothing as life entered the world. I once witnessed such care in a village, where a newborn was rinsed in warm water, wrapped in fresh linen, and placed at the mother's breast. Cleanliness was the first gift of life. Hospitals and infirmaries, often attached to monasteries, placed strong emphasis on washing. The sick were bathed when physicians prescribed it, sometimes to ease fever, other times to cleanse wounds. Bedclothes were changed as often as resources allowed, for foul linens were believed to worsen illness. I remember the smell of herbs steeped in boiling pots, carried from bed to bed, meant to refresh both air and flesh. These were not luxuries but necessities of healing. Monastic rules detailed the duties of infirmarians. They were instructed to wash the sick gently, to air out bedding, and to keep chambers clean. Though they knew nothing of microbes, they saw that filth bred misery and that cleanliness gave relief. The sound of water poured into basins in those halls became as familiar as prayers. For many, the infirmary was the only place where washing was given freely. Midwives relied on remedies passed down through generations. Rosemary, chamomile, and vinegar were used to cleanse wounds, while beeswax ointments softened chafed skin. They washed their hands and tools as best they could, for they knew that neglect led to danger. In their wisdom, rooted in practice rather than theory, they preserved countless lives. Their care was simple, yet born of long experience. During epidemics, washing became both feared and sought. Some believed that water opened pores to pestilence, yet attendants still cleansed patients when filth became unbearable. Linens were boiled, bodies wiped with vinegar, and rooms fumigated with herbs. These measures could not banish plague, but they eased suffering, offering dignity where hope was scarce. I recall the gratitude in the eyes of the dying when their faces were washed, a final kindness before the end. In noble households, physicians prescribed baths for the weak, warmed in tubs carried into chambers. Servants fetched bucket after bucket, pouring until the vessel was full. There, the sick were lowered, supported by many hands, their bodies eased by heat and fragrance. Such scenes revealed how even great halls depended on humble labor to bring cleanliness. Without water, even kings lay helpless. Children received particular care. Washed in warmed basins, they were kept free from rashes and sores, their clothes laundered with greater frequency than adults. Mothers understood instinctively that the tender skin of youth required more attention. To see a child freshly bathed, wrapped in linen, and laid upon a clean bed was to glimpse the fragile hope of a household. Cleanliness was as much a shield as bread or fire. When I recall these practices, I see the hands of women and brothers alike, lifting basins, wringing cloths, and offering care. Cleanliness in sickness and birth was not only about health, but about dignity, a way of showing love when strength failed. In every washed brow and laundered sheet lay the quiet testimony of compassion. These moments taught me that water and cloth could carry as much healing as prayer. In the long marches of war, water was as vital for washing as it was for drinking. Soldiers turned to rivers, ponds, and wells, cleansing their faces and arms when time allowed. I remember kneeling at a stream after days of dust, the chill striking, but the relief profound. No bathhouse stood in the fields, only what nature provided. Cleanliness in campaign was a luxury shaped by necessity. Armies carried small tubs, wooden or leather-lined, filled when the chance arose. Heated with fires if fuel permitted, they offered moments of respite to officers and knights. For the rank and file, Cloths dipped in water served to wipe sweat and grime from skin. I often thought of how such simple gestures gave courage, keeping men steady in hardship. Dirt might be endured, but not indefinitely. Regulations sometimes addressed hygiene, though in stern and practical terms. Latrines were to be dug downstream and away from camps, for commanders knew that foulness bred disease. When these rules were broken, sickness spread faster than any blade could cut. I saw more men laid low by dysentery than by arrows, and so the placing of waste pits became as important as fortifications. Lice and fleas haunted every camp. Combs, razors, and the boiling of garments were the only defense. I recall squires setting pots over fires, plunging shirts into scalding water to drive out vermin. Heads were shaved, beards trimmed, and bodies searched for infestation. To neglect these duties was to invite torment, for vermin respected neither rank nor valor. Even kings scratched beneath their armor. Feet bore the harshest trials. Long marches in damp boots brought sores and rot that crippled men. Those who changed linen wrappings, dried their footwear by fires, and greased the leather endured longer. I still remember the smell of singed boots lined by flames, a sound strategy against decay. To care for the feet was to care for survival, more urgent than swordplay itself. Castles offered better means when armies paused. Portable tubs were carried into chambers, screens erected for privacy, and servants hauled bucket after bucket. In these moments, knights could wash away grime, refreshed before returning to the field. Great halls sometimes contained fixed basins or pipes, but such comforts rarely followed us beyond stone walls. The contrast between campaign and castle was stark. Herbs eased the burdens of dirt and sweat. Vinegar rinses, wine washes, or rosemary steeped in water refreshed skin and masked odor. Even soldiers without coin learned to rub sage or mint upon themselves, a poor man's perfume against the stench of the march. These small remedies gave a measure of civility, allowing men to face one another with dignity even in mud and blood. When I look back on campaigns, I see not only the banners and charges, but the quiet struggle for cleanliness. Soldiers gathered by rivers, boots drying by flames, combs scraping through hair as lice hissed in the fire. These acts preserved strength and humanity, as vital as courage in battle. For without water, cloth, and care, no army could have endured the weight of war. Within the halls of the great, washing was not abandoned, but carefully arranged with the labor of many hands. Wooden tubs lined with cloth or metal were carried into chambers, set near braziers to warm the air. Servants filled them with bucket after bucket, mixing hot and cold until the water reached the master's liking. I recall the scent of herbs dropped into the bath, rising with steam in chambers hung with tapestries. Even in luxury, cleanliness required toil. Privacy was guarded by screens of wood or fabric, shielding bathers from view. In noble houses, such spaces became occasions for both rest and conversation, though rarely solitude. Lords bathed with attendants nearby, ready to fetch towels or pour more hot water. The ritual revealed not only wealth, but dependence, for without servants, even the mightiest knight remained captive to grime. Comfort was never separate from service. Some castles built more permanent accommodations. Pipes of lead carried water from cisterns above, trickling into basins fixed within stone walls. In rare cases, fireplaces warmed adjoining rooms, turning them into semi-bathing chambers. These were marvels of their time, imitating Roman luxuries long remembered in stories. Yet even here, tubs remained the true heart of washing, movable and practical. The grandeur lay in arrangement, not invention. Manorial households mirrored this practice on a smaller scale. Wooden barrels doubled as bathing tubs, lined with cloth to soften their edges. Families washed in turn, often beginning with the head of the house and ending with children. The water grew clouded, yet the effort was made, for even partial washing was better than none. Such scenes revealed the balance between practicality and care within rural estates. Festive occasions encouraged greater attention. before feasts, weddings, or receiving important guests, tubs were prepared with extra effort. Herbs and rosewater scented the bath, and fine linen awaited for drying. Nobles understood that appearance at table or court required more than garments alone. Cleanliness was itself a kind of presentation, proof of dignity. I saw entire households bustle to ready one bath, a task shared across many hands. Herbal sachets were often added to tubs, their fragrance rising with the heat. Sage, thyme, or chamomile softened the skin, while vinegar or wine might be poured to cleanse more thoroughly. These additions reflected both medical theory and household tradition, passed down in recipe books or by word of mouth. In noble chambers, baths became both hygienic and symbolic, a declaration of refinement. Servants themselves bathed when allowed, though rarely with the same luxury. They used smaller basins or shared tubs once their lords were done. Cleanliness spread unevenly through a household, yet even the lowest staff were granted water when occasion permitted. Their efforts, though humbler, reflected the same desire: to ease weariness, to wash away sweat, and to present themselves with order. When I recall such settings, I see the gleam of copper vessels, the steam curling through torchlight, and the endless footsteps of servants carrying water. Castles and manors may seem places of power, yet they too revealed how fragile cleanliness was, resting on the backs of many. The tub, plain or adorned, remained the center of it all, a vessel of labor, dignity, and fleeting relief. Life within medieval towns was never far from the reality of waste, and managing it became as essential as guarding the gates. Streets often collected refuse from kitchens, stables, and workshops, leaving them thick with mud and dung. In wet weather, filth turned to mire. In heat, it baked into dust and stench. I recall riding through London after rain, my horse's hooves sinking deep into the muck, the smell clinging to every breath. Cleanliness was fragile in such places. Cesspits lay behind houses, dug deep and lined with stone or timber. They gathered the waste of families, sometimes for years before being emptied. When neglected, they overflowed, seeping foulness into soil and water. Ordinances were written forbidding pits too near wells, yet people often ignored them, pressed by space and poverty. These hidden vaults, though unpleasant, were the unseen backbone of sanitation. Without them, life in towns would have collapsed under its own weight. The task of clearing cesspits fell to specialists known as gong farmers, or night soil men. They worked under cover of darkness, descending into pits with buckets and shovels, hauling filth to carts waiting above. I once saw such men at work, their bodies blackened with labor, their faces masked against the stench. It was a job despised, yet well paid, for few dared endure what they endured. Their service was vital, though seldom honored. Waste was carried beyond city walls, dumped into fields or rivers, sometimes spread upon land as fertilizer. Farmers accepted it grudgingly, for though it nourished soil, it also carried sickness. Authorities attempted to control where it was placed, but the demands of growing populations outpaced their measures. In truth, filth never stayed fully banished. It returned in odors, in fouled water, in sickness that crept quietly back. Street cleaning was ordered by law, but practice varied. Towns employed rakers to gather refuse, or commanded citizens to clear the ground before their own doors. I have seen fines given for tossing dung or offal into lanes, yet seen the same offences repeated the next day. Human nature resisted discipline, and so filth became the constant adversary of civic life. Trades worsened the problem. Butchers left blood in the gutters, tanners spilled lime and hides, dyers poured vats of colour into streams. Regulations pushed such crafts to the edges of towns, but the smells carried far. Even when authorities built conduits for fresh water, pollution lurked nearby, threatening all who drew from rivers. I remember fountains guarded fiercely, for one foul bucket could spoil them. Monasteries and wealthy households often stood cleaner, for they managed cesspits more carefully and employed workers to maintain order. But in crowded alleys, where families lived side by side, the struggle was harsher. Children played where refuse lay, and animals wandered freely. Disease found ready hosts in such places, spreading faster than priests could bury the dead. Cleanliness became not only a labor, but a matter of survival. Thinking back, I see how much of life in towns was a contest between filth and order. Gong farmers with their buckets, ordinances nailed to posts, servants sweeping before doorways, all stood against the tide of waste. Though the battle was never truly won, it was fought daily, proving that even in hardship, people refused to surrender entirely to decay. Their efforts gave shape to cities, imperfect but enduring. Markets were the pride of medieval towns, yet they carried the constant challenge of trades that befouled water and air. Butchers slaughtered beasts in stalls, letting blood run freely into gutters unless restrained by law. Tanners soaked hides in urine and lime, the stench spreading far beyond their yards. Dyers poured vats of bright liquid into streams, staining waters red, blue, or green. I remember walking past such quarters, the air thick with smells that clung to clothing and skin. Authorities soon recognized that commerce and cleanliness could not coexist without rules. Councils issued ordinances forbidding butchers from slaughtering near fountains or conduits. Tanneries were moved downstream, where flowing water could carry their waste away from drinking spots. Dyers were ordered to use specific channels for rinsing so that their colors did not poison wells. The balance was fragile, but without regulation, towns would have drowned in their own industry. Fines were levied upon those who disobeyed, though enforcement was uneven. I once saw a butcher punished for spilling blood into a street where children played, his penalty recorded in the rolls. Yet others continued their habits in secret, bribing watchmen or working at night. Law was strong in word, but weaker in deed, and so pollution lingered despite repeated commands. The struggle was unending. Markets themselves bore signs of compromise. Slaughterhouses were pushed to the edges of towns, their waste carried away in carts. Tanneries clustered along riversides, where foul water was less likely to mingle with conduits. Dyers' workshops stood near channels built for that purpose, though neighbours still complained of stench and discoloration. These divisions created districts of industry, shaping the geography of towns as surely as walls and towers. The people suffered when rules were ignored. Wells turned sour, fountains grew foul, and sickness followed quickly. Physicians warned of corrupted air, linking disease to the smells of waste. Whether their theories were correct or not, the danger was real, for water tainted by blood or lime spread illness swiftly. Citizens petitioned councils for stricter measures, showing how deeply cleanliness touched every life. Despite hardship, trade was never abandoned, for it sustained towns with wealth and goods. Leather for shoes, cloth for garments, meat for tables, all depended on the very crafts that fouled the air. People endured the smells, knowing that their comfort and livelihood were tied to the same hands that dirtied the streams. It was a constant negotiation between necessity and nuisance. I have seen markets bustling despite their burdens, women haggling over cuts of meat while waste trickled into the gutter. Children darted between dye vats, their laughter mixing with the curses of workers. Life continued, unbothered in moments, yet beneath it lay the pressing need for order. Ordinances and inspections were imperfect, but they stood as attempts to hold chaos at bay. Reflecting on those markets, I see not only filth, but resilience. Townspeople did not abandon their efforts to keep water clean, even when trades pressed hard against their rules. Each law, each fine, each petition was a step toward balance. The struggle to regulate butchers, tanners, and dyers reveals how medieval people understood the value of clean water, fragile, contested, yet always worth defending. From the 13th century onward, new writings appeared that guided the young not in arms or letters alone, but in manners of daily life. These courtesy books, copied and read in noble halls, urged discipline of the body as well as the spirit. I recall one that instructed, "Wash your hands and face each morning, keep your nails short, your hair neat, and your clothing free of stain." Such words may seem simple, Yet they shaped how generations came to measure civility. The advice did not speak only to nobles. Merchants, clerks, and even aspiring craftsmen found in these writings a mirror of refinement. Clean breath was praised, foul odour condemned, for one's presence in company mattered as much as one's words. To appear disordered was to invite shame, a sign of laziness or disrespect. In every hall where these texts were read aloud, the image of a well-kept body grew stronger. Washing before meals held a place of honour in these teachings. Students were told to cleanse their hands before touching bread, to use towels properly, and to avoid soiling shared dishes. These habits, already practiced, now gained moral weight through written instruction. I once sat with squires reciting such rules before supper, their laughter subdued by the stern look of a tutor. Cleanliness became part of education itself. Hair and beard, too, were subjects of guidance. Some books advised keeping hair combed and covered, beards trimmed according to local fashion. To appear slovenly was not only unattractive, but dishonourable. I saw knights reprimanded for neglecting such care, their untidiness judged as a flaw in character. In this way, grooming became not merely habit, but symbol of discipline and respect. Clothing received equal attention. Youth were urged to wear garments free from stains, to keep shoes in order, and to change linen often. Courtesy texts linked outward appearance with inner virtue, suggesting that disorder in dress betrayed disorder in soul. It was not wealth alone that mattered, but the visible effort to remain clean and neat. Even those of modest means could show dignity through careful washing. The reach of these teachings spread far. In towns, apprentices were instructed by masters to follow such rules, ensuring that shops presented a tidy image to customers. In courts, pages and young lords were tested not only in speech but in bearing, with cleanliness taken as proof of readiness. Across classes, the same expectation grew, that to live among others required order of body as well as of mind. While poverty made such ideals difficult for many, they still influenced behaviour. Peasants arriving at church on Sundays rinsed their faces, combed their hair, and wore their best linen. Even if garments were patched, they were clean, and that sufficed to show respect. The courtesy book set the tone, and people followed it as closely as their means allowed. Cleanliness became not just habit, but aspiration. As I remember these writings, I see their true power lay not in strict rules, but in shaping the idea of honour. They taught that the body itself was a vessel of dignity, to be tended daily with water, linen, and care. From noble courts to village greens, this vision spread, leaving behind a legacy that defined respectability. Cleanliness, guided by ink and parchment, became a measure of the soul's order. Not every family could afford soap, yet nature offered its own apothecary. Rosemary, sage, and lavender were steeped in boiling water, then cooled to rinse hair and face. The fragrance clung lightly to the skin, masking sweat and soothing the senses. I remember inns where basins were brought to travellers with such herbal waters, their steam rising like a quiet blessing. The practice was simple, but it left one feeling restored. Vinegar and wine were valued as cleansing agents, used to wash wounds or wipe the body. Their sharpness was thought to cut through impurity, and they refreshed when water alone seemed insufficient. I have seen soldiers on campaign rub vinegar-soaked cloths across their arms, grimacing at the sting, yet relieved at the cleanliness it brought. The method was crude but effective, carrying both discipline and health. Households often prepared powders to serve as deodorants. Alum, ground herbs, or even ashes were rubbed beneath arms or upon feet to control odour. These mixtures, though rough by modern measure, helped people endure close company in crowded towns or feasts. I once watched a merchant sprinkle a pouch of sage powder into his boots before entering a hall, mindful of the impression he carried with him. Ointments blended from lard, beeswax, and herbs softened skin, cracked by wind or work. In winter, these salves shielded against frost, while in summer, they eased burns and sores. Recipes for such remedies were copied into household books, treasured as carefully as prayers. Their making was often the task of women, who passed the knowledge from mother to daughter. Healing and cleanliness were intertwined in their hands. For the hair, vinegar rinses were common, leaving it glossy and lighter. Some added nettles or chamomile, believing these strengthened growth. Combing after such treatments loosened dirt and lice, leaving the scalp freshened. I recall the sharp scent filling a chamber, both pungent and invigorating, reminding me that even without soap, ingenuity found ways to preserve dignity. Feet, burdened by travel and labor, received their own remedies. Soaks of warm water infused with salt or herbs eased swelling and odor. Vinegar washes prevented sores from festering. I have seen pilgrims gather herbs along the road, boiling them at night to soothe their tired limbs. These small rituals kept the weary walking, carrying them to shrines and markets alike. Humoral theory framed many of these practices. Physicians taught that herbs could cool, moisten, or dry the body according to need. Recipes specified not only ingredients, but seasons, linking remedies to the turning of the year. Though their reasoning was bound to ancient texts, their results often brought comfort. People trusted these treatments because they worked within the rhythm of daily life. What lingers in my memory is not the strangeness of these remedies, but their resourcefulness. Without constant baths or costly soaps, families still preserved a sense of cleanliness through what fields and gardens provided. Each leaf, each root, each drop of vinegar became a tool against filth and decay. In those simple acts lay resilience, proving that the pursuit of dignity never waned, even in the humblest of homes. From the earliest years, children were taught the habits of washing, for parents knew that cleanliness shaped both health and reputation. Mothers rinsed little faces each morning with cool water, combed hair for lice, and changed linen as often as means allowed. A child appearing at church in soiled garments was a shame upon the family. I remember seeing mothers scold sons for muddy hands before prayers, a sign that even the young carried the weight of order. In schools, the expectation of neatness followed them. Parish teachers reminded pupils to wash before entering lessons, for ink-stained fingers and greasy hands spoiled parchment. Some rules commanded boys to appear with trimmed nails and combed hair, lest their disorder be seen as disrespect to both master and God. The sound of basins filled with water before lessons was as common as the chanting of psalms. Apprentices, bound by contract to masters, also faced strict standards. Many agreements listed clothing and linen among the provisions owed to them. A tidy appearance reflected not only the apprentice, but the reputation of the shop. I once saw a young boy in a tailor's service scrub his hands in a bucket before touching fine cloth, knowing a stain would bring punishment. Cleanliness was a part of training in craft. Guilds reinforced these customs. They demanded that apprentices arrive properly dressed and kept, for customers judged a trade by the look of its servants. A cobbler's lad with filthy nails or a baker's boy with grimy hair spoke of negligence. Masters understood that outward order suggested inner discipline, and so they pressed cleanliness as firmly as skill. Work and washing went hand in hand. Festivals and holy days gave children extra cause to wash. Before Easter or Christmas, families ensured their young wore freshly laundered shifts and combed hair. In villages, I saw boys and girls bathed in basins by hearths, squealing at the cold water, yet glowing in the pride of appearing clean for church. These rituals taught that cleanliness was part of reverence, not vanity. Even in poverty, small efforts were made. A single shift, carefully laundered, was reserved for Sundays, worn proudly despite patches. Combing could be done with a wooden tool, rinsing with a shared basin. Such gestures mattered more than their modest means suggested. They instilled in the young the idea that dignity did not depend solely on wealth, but on discipline and care. Teachers often reminded pupils that manners and cleanliness were inseparable. Courtesy books, read aloud in classrooms, instructed children to wash hands before meals, keep breath pleasant, and hair orderly. These lessons, written in ink and spoken in stern voices, lingered beyond the schoolroom. I watched lads in the marketplace bow to elders with clean faces, proof that their schooling shaped more than letters. When I reflect on the youth of those times, I see how washing was stitched into the fabric of education. From mothers at hearths to masters in workshops, from teachers in schools to priests in churches, all impressed the same lesson: that cleanliness was a duty. It was not indulgence, but discipline, preparing children to enter society with honor. Thus, even the smallest rinsings carried the weight of the future. On the long roads of pilgrimage, dust clung to every step, and washing became a daily need as much as prayer. Pilgrims carried little, yet always sought water at bridges, wells, or hospices along the way. I remember dipping my hands into a stone trough outside a chapel, the water cool after hours of walking under sun. Such small cleansings gave strength to continue, each wash a renewal of body and will. Inns provided basins and jugs to weary travellers. A servant might bring warm water to the common room, setting it upon a bench with coarse towels. Faces, hands, and feet were rinsed before food, for no host wished guests to soil the table. Even the poorest lodging understood this duty, for cleanliness marked hospitality. I can still see the steam rising from copper jugs in firelit rooms. Pilgrim guides often mentioned the locations of clean springs, directing travellers to them as carefully as to shrines. These springs became gathering places where strangers shared stories while washing away dust. Some were said to hold healing power, and whether true or not, the refreshment they offered was undeniable. To kneel at a spring, rinse the face, and drink deeply was to feel heaven's mercy upon the road. Hospitallers, whose task was to shelter the wandering, gave special care to washing. At their doors, travellers were offered not only bread, but water for their feet. I recall seeing a brother of the order bend low, pouring water over a pilgrim's cracked soles. In that act, service and cleanliness joined, echoing the example of Christ washing the feet of his disciples. It was kindness made tangible. Communal dormitories demanded vigilance. Lice and fleas travelled as faithfully as the pilgrims themselves, hiding in garments and bedding. Delousing became a nightly ritual, combs drawn through hair, shirts boiled if firewood permitted, beds beaten with sticks to chase out vermin. These tasks, though wearying, kept disease at bay and allowed strangers to rest side by side. Hygiene was survival in such crowded quarters. Journeys also reshaped habits. Washing was done more frequently in streams and rivers, for sweat and mud could not be ignored on the road. Garments were rinsed when possible, strung on bushes to dry as pilgrims paused for prayer. I once walked past a field of fluttering shifts and cloaks, a sight that showed how the need for cleanliness followed wherever feet carried the faithful. Even at great shrines, washing was part of devotion. Basins awaited pilgrims at entrances, for they were expected to present themselves purified. Some sanctuaries offered full baths, though most provided only vessels for hands and faces. Cleanliness was tied to reverence, reminding all that to approach the holy required both inward and outward preparation. The act was simple, yet it carried profound weight. The memory of those roads is marked not only by prayers and relics, but by the countless washings that punctuated the journey. From basins in inns to springs in fields, from hospitallers' courtyards to riverside camps, pilgrims sought water as eagerly as blessings. In their ablutions lay both dignity and endurance, proving that the path to sanctity was travelled with weary feet, clean hands, and steadfast hearts. In later centuries, a tale spread that the men and women of the Middle Ages cared nothing for washing, that they lived always in filth. Yet those of us who walked those roads know it was not so. People valued cleanliness, though their means differed from our own. They washed their faces each morning, changed linen regularly, and bathed when circumstances allowed. The body was not abandoned to dirt, but tended with discipline suited to the times. Full immersion was less common than today, but not absent. Bathhouses, rivers, and private tubs all offered opportunities, though not daily. Instead, small washings were practiced faithfully: hands before meals, feet after journeys, faces upon waking. Linen absorbed sweat and was laundered often, doing the work that constant bathing could not. To judge them by modern measures is to mistake adaptation for neglect. Archaeological finds confirm this truth. Combs of bone, ear scoops of bronze, tweezers and nail cleaners appear in graves and houses alike. These tools were not ornaments, but signs of daily grooming. Even the poorest possessed them, showing that care for the body was widespread. Dirt was fought not only with water, but with diligence, carried out with simple instruments at hand. Writings of the time also bear witness. Courtesy books urged daily washing. Physicians prescribed baths with herbs, and household accounts list soap and laundry among regular expenses. City laws regulated conduits to preserve clean water, proving its importance. To claim that bathing was forgotten is to ignore the words left by those who lived then, who wrote plainly of their habits. The decline of some public baths in the later Middle Ages owed less to ignorance than to fear. When plague and the Great Pox spread, physicians warned against frequent immersion, believing open pores drew in sickness. Morality also shaped suspicion as bathhouses grew entangled with vice. But these changes were responses to circumstance, not signs of indifference to hygiene. People sought safety, not filth. Rural folk, too, made their efforts. Streams and ponds became their baths, basins of warmed water their tubs. On feast days and holy occasions, they washed more thoroughly, presenting themselves in clean linen at church. Cleanliness was woven into rhythm, shaped by seasons and need. Even without elaborate plumbing, the countryside bore its own form of hygiene, steady and practical. The notion of a dirty Middle Ages often arose from contrasts with later centuries when new customs and technologies emerged. But for their time, medieval people managed with what they had, and they managed well enough to preserve health, dignity, and community. Their lives were not without odour, but neither were they lived in neglect. The truth lies between caricature and ideal. When I think of those days, I do not see people sunk in filth, but men and women who combed their hair, laundered their linen, and washed their hands before breaking bread. Their world was different, yet their care was real. The myth of utter dirt belongs to later ages, not to theirs. Reality was humbler, more human, a steady striving for cleanliness in a world of constant labour and imperfection. Much of what we know of medieval cleanliness comes not from hearsay, but from the ground itself. Archaeologists have uncovered combs carved from bone, some worn smooth by daily use, others broken where teeth snapped in the battle with lice. Tweezers, nail cleaners, and small mirrors lie buried in graves, silent testimony to grooming habits. Basins of metal or pottery appear in excavations, reminders that water for washing stood in every household, whether humble or noble. Bathhouse remains have been found in towns from London to Regensburg, their stone foundations and heating systems echoing with the memory of steam-filled rooms. Conduit houses, too, stand as proof of urban efforts to channel clean water. In monasteries, lavatoria with carved basins and drains show how communities organized collective washing. These structures tell us more clearly than rumor. Medieval people valued cleanliness enough to carve it into stone. Textual evidence complements the material. Medical writings such as the Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum describe the benefits of washing hands, face and body with moderation. The Trotula texts offered guidance on skin and hair care, showing concern even for cosmetic cleanliness. Courtesy books gave moral weight to daily grooming, teaching that outward neatness reflected inward discipline. These works were copied and spread, shaping customs across centuries. Household accounts reveal the practical side. Purchases of soap, rosewater, and laundry services appear regularly in the records of both noble and merchant families. Payments to laundresses, to barbers, and to water carriers testify to the labour that sustained hygiene. Ordinances regulating bathhouses, conduits, and waste disposal further proved that civic leaders understood the importance of clean bodies and clean water to communal life. Excavations of cesspits bring even sharper detail. Layers of discarded material preserve traces of soap residues, herbal infusions, and fabric fragments. From these, scholars piece together the daily routines of households. Though unpleasant, such findings confirm that washing and laundering were woven into the rhythm of existence. Even in waste, the evidence of cleanliness endures. Imagery also speaks. Illuminated manuscripts show scenes of hand-washing before meals, of women rinsing linen at rivers, of bathers in wooden tubs. These depictions were not fantasy, but reflections of common practice, drawn for readers who recognized them as familiar. Stained glass and carvings occasionally included such acts, linking them to moral lessons about purity and order. The visual record joins the written and material in chorus. Even poetry and song sometimes mentioned cleanliness. Troubadours praised the beauty of well-groomed ladies, chroniclers remarked upon the tidiness of courts, and satirists mocked those who neglected their bodies. Such words, though varied in intent, confirm that hygiene mattered socially as well as physically. To be described as unwashed was insult, to be praised as fresh was honor. Cleanliness shaped identity as much as courage or wit. Looking upon these traces, I see a pattern both consistent and clear. Archaeology, manuscripts, ordinances, and art all reveal that the people of the Middle Ages did not surrender to filth. They built, wrote, and labored to keep themselves clean according to their means. The memory of their efforts remains preserved in soil and parchment alike, whispering across time that dignity was sought even in hardship. Cleanliness in the Middle Ages was never a single story, but a tapestry woven from many lands. In the north, people embraced saunas and sweat baths, their bodies steamed and scraped in wooden huts built against the cold. To the east, Slavic banyas filled with birch branches and vapor offered both washing and fellowship. I recall travelers speaking of the shock of plunging into icy rivers after such baths, a custom that hardened the spirit as much as the body. Across the Rhineland, Jewish communities built mikvaot, ritual baths dug deep into the earth. Their steps led to cool waters fed by springs, serving laws of purity that shaped family and faith. In Iberia, hammams carried forward Roman and Islamic traditions, guiding bathers through chambers of increasing heat. The fragrance of herbs and the discipline of ritual made these places as much spiritual as bodily. Each land bore its own form of cleansing. Italian cities rose as centers of soap-making, where hard bars of olive oil soap from Castile and Marseille traveled north through trade. Their fragrance and durability were prized in households far beyond their birthplace. I remember merchants boasting of their stocks, carrying the scent of Mediterranean groves into northern markets. To own such soap was not only practical, but a sign of connection to distant lands. In France and England, bathhouses thrived in towns, often standing near markets or bridges. They were places of relaxation and talk, where men and women sought relief from toil. Some grew tainted by suspicion, yet many remained ordinary parts of life. Ordinances regulated them, showing how civic leaders valued their role. The steam that rose from their roofs was a familiar sight on cold evenings. Northern climates shaped customs differently than those of the south. In Scandinavia, frequent bathing was preserved by necessity, while in warmer lands, water scarcity or differing traditions meant smaller daily washings. Yet even where baths were rare, linen shifts were changed often, carrying away sweat and soil. The meaning of clean shifted with climate, but the pursuit of dignity remained constant. Monastic traditions crossed borders, carrying with them the knowledge of water channels, lavers, and latrines. From the Irish houses to Cluny in France, from German abbeys to Spanish cloisters, the sound of water trickling in stone troughs marked a shared discipline. The monasteries stood as models, teaching towns and villages alike how order could be built around clean water. Their influence was felt in every land. Local law reflected these differences. Cities like London and Paris issued regulations to protect conduits, while Italian communes punished those who fouled rivers. German towns restricted tanners and dyers to certain districts, acknowledging the fragile balance between trade and health. Each region crafted its own rules, yet all bore the same recognition. Water was precious, and without care, life unraveled. When I look back across Europe, I see no uniform way of washing, but many paths shaped by climate, faith, and custom. Yet within all this variety, the same desire endures: to live with dignity, to keep the body presentable, and to show respect to God and neighbor alike. Diversity did not weaken the pursuit of cleanliness. It revealed its universality, binding distant lands in a common human effort. To walk through the Middle Ages is to learn that clean bore a meaning unlike ours, yet no less deliberate. It did not demand daily immersion, but visible order. A washed face, combed hair, trimmed nails, and fresh linen against the skin. The effort lay not in endless water, but in steady habit, small washings repeated with discipline. I saw men judged not by perfume or polish, but by whether their hands and garments showed care. Cleanliness was both modest and practical. Water itself required labor. Every drop heated for washing was drawn from wells, carried in buckets, and boiled over flames. To fill a tub took hours, a reminder that bathing was a work of many, not a simple gesture. Servants, laundresses, and water carriers bore the burden, turning cleanliness into a collective effort. I remember the sweat of those who hauled casks through crowded streets, their labor unspoken yet essential. Linen shifts and shirts became the true armor of cleanliness. By absorbing sweat and oils, they spared heavier garments from foulness. Changing and laundering them was more powerful than any rare bath. The sight of fields covered with drying linen spoke of families striving for order. Even peasants with little sought to own at least 2 shifts, so that one might always be kept clean. Public expectations gave weight to these habits. At meals, unwashed hands drew shame. In church, unkempt appearance was dishonor. Courtesy books and sermons alike reminded people that cleanliness reflected not wealth, but virtue. A man may have worn patched clothes, but if they were freshly laundered, he stood with dignity. In this way, social respect depended as much on soap and water as on word and deed. Cleanliness was also bound to faith. Christians washed before Mass, Jews immersed in mikvahot, Muslims in ablutions before prayer. These practices made water sacred as well as practical. I have seen pilgrims rinse their faces at shrines, tears and water mingling as they approached holy relics. To be clean was not only to be healthy, but to stand rightly before God. The meaning of clean was never uniform across Europe. In some lands, saunas or hammams gave full bathing a regular rhythm. In others, washing was limited to basins and buckets. Yet the goal remained the same: to keep the body orderly, to prevent odors, to show care in public life. This variety did not weaken the pursuit, but revealed its many faces. What strikes me most is the resilience behind these customs. Without pipes or drains, without soap in abundance, people still crafted systems that worked. They built conduits, carried water, scrubbed garments, and burned herbs. They made do with what the age allowed, proving that the desire for dignity finds ways even in hardship. Cleanliness was not forgotten, it was redefined. When I close my eyes, I see hands dipped in basins, linen drying in sunlight, steam rising from a rare tub, and perfumes masking the limits of water. In all these gestures lies the medieval meaning of clean, a balance between labor and necessity, between body and soul. It was a fragile order, yet it endured, carrying people through centuries without plumbing, yet never without pride.